Hey, welcome to 12 Tone. Have you ever heard these drums? Whether you know it or not, you probably have. That's a beat known as the Amen break, originally played by G.C. Coleman from the soul band The Winstons, and according to WhoSampled.com, it's been sampled over 6,000 times. It's appeared in all sorts of genres and even inspired the creation of new ones. It's one of the most ubiquitous sounds in all of recorded music, and everything sounds good over the Amen break. But why? First, a little history. The Amen break comes from the 1969 song Amen Brother, an instrumental jam recorded as the B-side for the Winstons' debut single, Color Him Father. That single reached number 7 on the Billboard Hot 100 and won a Grammy for Best R&B Song. And that might have been the end of the story for the Amen break. It's 4 bars in the B-side to the only successful single by an otherwise fairly obscure soul band. But history had other plans for Coleman's solo. In the 80s, with the rise of hip-hop, DJs were on the hunt for interesting breakbeats to loop. Amen Brother fit the bill perfectly, and its popularity exploded after it was featured on the first official edition of Ultimate Breaks and Beats, a 1986 compilation album published by a DJ called Breakbeat Lou. That same year, Salt and Pepper released their debut album, Hot, Cool, and Vicious, which features probably the first mainstream recorded sampling of the Amen break in their song I Desire. A couple years later, in 1988, the break would see perhaps its most iconic use in NWA's Straight Outta Compton. Moving into the 90s, the Amen break kept going strong in American hip-hop, but it was also starting to catch the attention of the UK dance scene. Songs like LTJ Bookham's Demons theme, took the break in new directions, and electronic DJs quickly became obsessed with it. To quote one such DJ, The Invisible Man,
"It wasn't long before the Amen break was being used by practically every producer within the scene. After a while, tracks using the Amen break virtually had a genre all of their own."
That genre is often called drum and bass, or D&B for short, and while it would eventually start incorporating other drum breaks as well, the sound of Coleman's playing is deep in its DNA. Pretty quickly, D&B artists transitioned from just looping the beat to chopping it up and rearranging the sounds to create new beats, like in the Busy Bee and Deluxe song Take a Deep Breath. That practice continues to this day, but in other styles, the break has also become kind of like the Wilhelm scream in film. You know, this. Artists familiar with the break often use it as a cute little Easter egg for listeners in the know, like in Slipknot's Pulse of the Maggots. It even appears in the theme song for Futurama, which surprisingly is not the first time I've said that about a musical device on this channel. That's a really brief history, but I think it's enough to lead us to our main question. Why this one? What makes the Amen break so special? One theory that I found in a surprising number of articles is that it's because the peaks of the waveform align with the golden ratio, and... Okay, look, I don't want to dwell on this for too long, but can we please stop attributing everything to the golden ratio? Like, sure, if you're writing about Renaissance and Romantic painters who intentionally used it to proportion their works, go nuts. Although even there's a lot of open historical questions about the extent to which that actually happened. Check out Mario Livio's book, The Golden Ratio, for more on that. But for the Amen break, it's transparently nonsense. In order to make the argument work, you have to ignore most of the drum hits and all of the precise timing, and even if it did actually line up, reducing the appeal of such a rich, complex drum beat down to just, I don't know, it sounds like Fibonacci is lazy and unhelpful. We can do better. Instead, I'm going to turn to an approach described by Dr. Ethan Hine, where he starts with a really basic drum groove and changes it a bit at a time until he winds up with a full Amen break. Before I do, though, a couple things to keep in mind. First, many songs that sample the break only use the first bar or two. And that makes sense. The first half of the loop is a pretty straightforward groove, similar to what Coleman was playing in the rest of the song, but the second half gets increasingly syncopated and rhythmically unstable. That works perfectly in its original context as a short drum interlude with a beginning, a middle, and an end, but once you start looping it, you no longer have an end, and you don't really want to deal with your groove going off the rails every 4 bars, so it's easier to just stick to the first part. We're still going to look at the whole thing because the back half is neat, but just be aware that the elements we see there are probably not that relevant to the break's popularity as a sampled beat. Second, this method isn't meant to describe how Coleman conceived of the break. Most of this will be things that he, as a seasoned soul drummer, would certainly know, but I don't mean to imply that his artistic process involved building it up brick by brick like we're about to. Think of this more as a guide for how to listen to and perhaps even learn to play the break. We're drawing out the key features one by one to understand what each one brings to the beat and to see why a drummer like Coleman might be inclined to play it the way he did. With that out of the way, let's start with level 1. This is the basic underlying groove, nowhere near what Coleman actually played, but we can think of it as the skeleton on top of which all the interesting parts are built. It's so simple that it feels kinda silly to analyze, but I'm gonna do it anyway because it'll give me a useful foundation to refer back to later. For this, I'm gonna borrow a framework from my friend 8-Bit Music Theory, who breaks a drum groove up into 3 distinct layers. First, there's the beat, a powerful grounding line that emphasizes the strong parts of the bar, especially the downbeat. In this groove, that role is filled by the kick drum. Next is the engine, a cross rhythm played against the beat to create interest and momentum. Unsurprisingly, the engine here is provided by a backbeat snare. And finally, you have the constant, a rhythmically dense part that fills the gaps between the other two and ties everything together. While the beat is keeping large-scale time, outlining the metric structure of bars, the constant is in charge of small-scale time, explicitly defining how those beats are subdivided. This is often done on a hi-hat, but in the Amen break, Coleman plays it with straight eighths on a ride cymbal. Each line has its own job, and while those jobs may sound obvious here, once we start adding stuff, these percussive functions will help us keep track of what's going on, and more importantly, why. Anyway, level 2 isn't that different. All we're doing here is taking one of the ride cymbals in bar 4 and replacing it with a crash cymbal. This gets its own level because it's the only change he makes to the constant layer. Beyond that, he holds completely steady on that ride cymbal even as the other parts drift out of alignment like a rhythmic lifeline in case you start to get lost. You may lose the downbeat, but you'll always have the pulse. Ending the solo on a crash cymbal is climactic, and while it's positioned on an offbeat eighth, it does help set up the following snare, adding a greater sense of closure to the final beat of the break. Remember that, it'll come up again in a minute. First though, level 3. Here we take each kick and double it up, hitting again an eighth note later, and we're starting to hear a little bit of the Amen break emerge from its cocoon. This change to the beat layer is, again, pretty easy to explain. The double kick helps walk you into the backbeat snare, making those engine hits feel even more compelling. But now there's a lot of kicks happening, so for level 4, we're gonna remove some of them. Specifically, we'll remove the kick from beat 3 of every bar, and just for fun, let's also take out the one from beat 1 of the last bar. We left in the offbeat eighth notes because those were mostly helping set up the snares, but taking the kicks off of beat 3 is like zooming out. Instead of having 2 strong beats per bar, all of the emphasis of the beat layer is focused entirely on the downbeat. This gets subverted in the last bar where he also skips the kick on 1, and the resulting collapse of the beat layer's function is a large part of why that last bar feels so disorienting. But when it comes to the chaos of the last bar, most of the heavy lifting is done by our next change. On level 5, in the last 2 bars, he takes the snare on beat 4 and pushes it back an eighth note. The backbeat snare is such an iconic sound, dating back almost a century at this point, and even by the late 60s it was deeply ingrained in most styles of popular music. But between the kick drum not playing the strong beats and the snares hitting late, it almost sounds like he's changed time signatures here. Even if you do count it correctly, the rhythm still plays tricks on you thanks to changes in the previous layers. The crash sounded like it was there specifically to set up a snare on beat 4, and that syncopated kick from beat 3 is too. He's manipulating the basic groove in order to create even clearer signposts for a rhythmic resolution on beat 4, but it's a fake out. There's no resolution there. This is at its most disruptive in bar 4, but it's important to note that he starts this in bar 3, anticipating the rhythmic imbalance that builds in intensity throughout that final bar. Again, it's worth remembering that this was originally intended to ramp back up into a full band section with a final resolution on the downbeat of the next bar. It's just that as a sampled breakbeat, that transition gets cut off in the loop. Level 6 brings us one last change in the kick. Remember how those offbeat eighths were setting up the snares that followed? Well, for each of those that still has a snare to set up, we're going to double it up with an extra 16th note. In the first 2 bars, this creates a nice little push-pull dynamic where both snares are preceded by 2 kicks, but the approach to beat 2 is slower with 2 eighth notes, while beat 4 is fast with 2 16ths. This gives it a pleasing sort of symmetry, and the faster kicks create a greater sense of finality on the second snare, wrapping up the bar neatly before the next one starts. The disappearance of that closure is another part of what makes the back half feel like it does, especially in bar 4 where he flips it around and does the same double kick to set up the snare on 2 instead. This little misdirect makes it harder to track the bar line. Your internal metronome is telling you this is beat 2, but your pattern recognition skills are saying it sounds like 4. Couple that with the out-of-place snare that preceded it, and it's easy to see how one might struggle to count through this section. And that's it for the kick drum. We've completed our beat layer and our constant layer. All that's left is to beef up our engine. To do this, in level 7, we're going to take every snare drum that's still on a beat and add a second hit 3/16 after. This snare echo falls between the cracks of the eighth note ride, so adding them significantly increases the overall density of attacks in the bar. The double kicks already introduced the idea of 16th notes, but they were prepared by another kick on the preceding eighth. This is the first time we've seen an offbeat 16th without any preparation, and you can hear how it's sort of bouncing around in between the rides on either side. The ones on beat 4 also sound like approach notes setting up the next downbeat, but the missing kick on beat 3 means that setup is sometimes left hanging. This leaves us with a gap, which level 8 fills with even more snares. Specifically, he takes that bouncy effect between the ride and snare and extends it, placing another snare hit right after the ride on beat 3. He also adds an extra one right after the downbeat of the last bar, where we again have a missing kick. That last extra snare is especially interesting because not only does it mimic the beat 3 rhythm from earlier bars, it's also 3/16 after the previous snare, just like the hit we added in level 7. He's effectively taking the whole snare figure of beat 4 and shifting it back an eighth while simultaneously recreating the snare kick figure from beat 3. This double callback to multiple different snare structures from other parts of previous bars makes it really difficult to recognize this as beat 1, even though if you count along with a ride symbol, it definitely is. That gives us our complete groove, so let's take a step back and look at the full structure. Bars 1 and 2 start off slow with a couple eighth notes, to provide a sense of rest and a sort of baseline for the rhythmic energy. On the and of 2, though, things pick up. Between the bouncy ride snare figure and the double kick, he plays something on pretty much every 16th note for the rest of the bar. The only other break we get is this momentary pause on beat 4, letting the backbeat snare settle for a moment before throwing out a couple more 16ths to set up the next downbeat. This gives the bar a beautiful rhythmic arc, busy when it needs to be, but with enough moments of rest to not get lost. This pattern continues until about halfway through bar 3, where suddenly he flips to a new gear. One thing I want to highlight, though, is how few changes we actually made to the back half. All we did was delay some snare hits and treat beat 1 like it was beat 3, and suddenly the whole thing is thrown into chaos. It goes to show how important patterns are. After just a couple repetitions, we become so confident about what we're expecting to hear that if he wants to throw us off, all he has to do is play anything else. Although to be fair, those changes do subvert some of the strongest metric conventions of this style of drumming, which also helps. But okay, I lied when I said we were done. We've got all the hits, but the Amen break is more than just a series of drum hits. If it wasn't, I could just play this, and expect the same results, but I doubt my cheap MIDI performance is gonna inspire any new genres anytime soon. No, if we really want to understand what makes the Amen break so iconic, we have to talk about the intangibles, the elements of the recording that can't be captured by notation. There's a lot of these, but I want to focus on what I'm calling the 3 T's: timbre, touch, and timing. Timbre is more or less the sound of the particular drum kit. When he played the break, Coleman didn't just play the abstract concept of a snare hit, he hit a specific snare drum, tuned a specific way, on a specific mic, in a specific room with specific acoustics, and then the sound was processed in a specific way. If you were to play this same beat on your own drum kit, all of those parameters would be different, and so would the resulting timbre. Touch, on the other hand, is the way he plays each individual attack. Like, notice how in bar 2, the snares on beats 2 and 4 are more accented than the other hits scattered around the bar. The kick on the downbeat is also harder and heavier than the ones on offbeats, driving home that singular metric emphasis. Those are pretty high-level touch observations, but if you zoom in close enough, you'll find that every individual hit in the entire break sounds ever so slightly different. Not enough to really be worth notating, but the human body isn't a precise enough machine to deliver exactly the same strike at exactly the same angle and velocity every single time. You're always going to see some fluctuation, and similarly, the timing of his hits also moves around a bit. The MIDI example was quantized, so every attack was timed out to play perfect straight 16ths, but that's not what Coleman did. He was pretty close, but most of the hits, especially the offbeat ones, are laid back ever so slightly from that quantized grid. Like if I slow down the double kick in bar 2, you can hear how the second one is slightly shorter than the first. Not so much that I'd call it swung, but not perfectly rigid either. But the problem with these, from an analytical standpoint, is that they're ephemeral. If you played another take, all the touches and timings would have been slightly different. Even timbre is ephemeral to an extent. While it wouldn't change from take to take, if the band went out on tour, the drums would sound different at each show depending on the acoustics of the venue. As such, traditional analysis doesn't tend to pay much attention to these intangible parameters because they're not considered a core part of what defines a specific musical work, and that's fair enough. But everything changes when you switch from a performance to a sample. As soon as you start looping it, all those tiny little nuances become crystallized. There's no fluctuations from bar to bar because it's always the same bar. The intangible details aren't random anymore. They become a predictable part of the groove, and that consistency allows new musical structures to be built around them. So while it's tempting to say the Amen break is this series of attacks in this order, that's not the full story. The Amen break is what happened when G.C. Coleman played this series of attacks in this order in a studio in Atlanta in 1969. But there's one last thing I need to address because the story of the Amen break doesn't have a happy ending. Coleman wasn't listed as a songwriter on Amen Brother, and even if he had been, the vast majority of the artists who sampled it never paid any sort of royalties or licensing fees. In 2015, a pair of British DJs set up a fundraiser to pay back the artists, and they did wind up raising £24,000 for the Winston's bandleader, Richard Lewis Spencer, but by then it was too late for Coleman. He had already died, broke and homeless, almost a decade earlier. According to friends, he probably wasn't even aware of the impact his drum break had had on the world. And look, I know the question of music copyright is a complicated one, both legally and ethically. I'm not here to debate exactly how much compensation Coleman deserved, but I do know this. He deserved a lot more than he got. And I think it's important to tell this part of the story because ultimately what makes the Amen break great isn't the precise placement of snares and rides or anything else you can find by dissecting the sound wave. What makes it great is G.C. Coleman. His incredible sense of groove is what all those DJs latched onto, and it's why over 50 years after it was first recorded, his work is still finding new life. Anyway, thanks for watching, thanks to our Patreon patrons for making these videos possible, and extra special thanks to our featured patrons, Kevin Wilamowski, Susan Jones, Jill Sundgaard, Duck, Howard Levine, Warren Huart, Damian Fowler-Sutherland, and John Hancock. If you want to help out and help us pick the next song we analyze too, there's a link to our Patreon on screen now. Oh, and don't forget to like, share, comment, subscribe, and above all, keep on rockin'.